So friends, let me ask you, what are the threads that are woven into the tapestry of your life that over the years have helped you to find a sense of well-being, of groundedness, of connection to the world around you? And how do those threads show up? How are they alive in your life today? Friends, welcome back to Heartscapes, where we are exploring practices that help us to live lives that are grounded, that are spacious, that are connected, and that help us to remember ourselves. You might be watching this on one of two places. You might be watching it on my Heartscapes Reiki YouTube channel. You might be watching it on Heartscapes Urban Homestead YouTube channel. I decided to share this video in both of these places because this question that we began with, this question of the threads that are woven into our life that support our sense of well-being, is one that I often ask my Reiki students to explore in terms of how they came to practicing the system of Reiki. And it's a question that I ask of the people who come to me to work in the garden and to learn from the garden as our first and greatest teacher of how to live lives in these ways. And so when I was asked to explore a similar question in a piece of writing for a writing project that is underway, this is kind of where I went. I went to the practices in my life that have helped me to do this. And really, that brings me back to both the garden and to the system of Reiki. Now, I wrote this piece of writing from the perspective of my relationship with the garden because it is the first thread that I can really identify consistently in my life that has contributed to my well-being and my sense of grounding, my sense of connection and spaciousness, which of course is why I'm still here working in the garden and now sharing it with all of you here on YouTube. But in my life, over the past decade, that relationship with the garden and its relationship to my well-being has been intimately woven into my relationship with the system of Reiki and with the system of soul collage, which is the third thread that kind of ties up this bundle for me. And so really, for me, they're intimately connected. And I've mentioned that here in both YouTube channels, that the garden and the system of Reiki really function together in my life. And I enjoy sharing teachings from both of those spaces. So I decided to, by way of reintroduction of myself on both of these channels, to share this piece of writing with you because, well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think it's actually a pretty solid introduction between me and you as people on this path together, to just get a little bit of an understanding of where I'm coming from, where the values and perspectives that you'll see on this YouTube channel come from. And I hope it'll also be a really open and imaginative invitation to all of you to consider this question. What are the threads that have woven together in your life, the tapestry of your experiences, that contribute to moments when you have felt a sense of deep well-being, of groundedness, of connection, of spaciousness, and, of calm, of being connected to the web of life? So over on the Reiki channel, I have a series called Reiki Storytime, where I share pieces of writing, usually from other authors, but occasionally from myself. And I guess over on the Garden channel, we'll call this Garden Storytime, because I'm just going to go ahead and read you this piece of writing. I think that's just the most concise way of sharing this material with you. And as I do, I really invite you to be in your own curious mind, in your own curious heart with this question, right? With this invitation to look back on these threads in your own life. As part of this writing assignment, I was also invited to create a practice that people could engage in to kind of delve into some of the material that was presented in the writing. And so if you would like to be guided through a practice that helps you to consider this question, to helps you to connect with the garden, with yourself, with the web of life, I would be very happy to devote a little bit of time to make another video sharing that practice and share it in both places. So if that is of interest to you, if you would appreciate a practice like that, please do comment down below so that I know there's interest, and I'll create it for you. All right, well, I think without any further ado, I'd like to invite you to Settle down into a cozy place in your garden, in your home, grab a nice, delicious beverage, and settle in for a little bit of story time. So this is Rooted, Reaching, and Connected, a gardener's journey from trauma to transformation. Part 1, Rooted, the garden as a trauma response. I first came to the garden through trauma and the sheer raw necessity to bioremediate intolerable fear, born of the sudden realization of just how dangerous this life can be. My eyes were opened that day, my feet torn from the solid ground, unrooted, my worldview expanded in the worst way. Yeah, I knew there was horrible shit out there in the world, but until that day, my awareness was localized to the challenges closest to home. A divorce leading to a disconnected family, drug addiction ruining the minds of friends not yet fully grown, and the ways that people can hurt each other when they feel unsafe. But when the Twin Towers of New York fell, under the weight and momentum of several hundred people inside 2 airplanes turned missiles, when the realization dawned on me that pain and death could fall from the sky, and when my government's response was to rain pain and death down on people who were not even involved, miring us in years of war falsely justified through deaths of those who had leapt from the falling windows of those monoliths of capitalist patriarchy. Well, that was a perspective on the diabolical aspects of human nature that my young mind was just not prepared to navigate. I was just 24 years old, newly married, doing my best to mother my 4-year-old daughter, but not yet fully grounded in adulthood. Everything about my life felt frightening already, between becoming a parent so young, struggling through my first semesters of college, and barely making rent each month. My heart felt strained and fluttery most of the time. The terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and the resulting opportunistic military actions in Iraq were the straw that broke my heart into a million pieces. My mind, my body rebelled hard. I was instantly radicalized against the invisible, sinister forces that be. I threw myself into anti-war activism, absorbing way too much political education in too short of a time. I learned to navigate my increasingly existential fear by externalizing it into angry potshots at anyone who seemed to be in charge. It would be many years until I'd come to understand what was happening in my nervous system, the way that fear was running trauma responses through my body much of the time, and the resulting persistent feeling of being held upside down by forces unseen and barely known to me. For several years, I felt that I could not get my feet planted fully on the ground. The tension arising inside of me needed to be focused, challenged, and at all cost needed to be moved the hell out of my body. I was searching for something I could control, since the events playing out on the world stage felt so desperately out of control. Led by this intense directive emanating from the very center of my body, my intuition began to whisper a pathway out of this topsy-turvy cycle of fear. Put your hands in the soil, the voice said. Find a tiny piece of earth that you can make your own and plant something lovely. Something that will move you off of a diet of anger and anxiety and nourish you with beauty and possibility. So, for the first time in my life, I planted a garden. I sank my hands into the soil and directed my attention downwards. I began to notice the cycles of the earth, to collaborate with them in ways that served both my family and the land. As I did so, carefully over time, my mind began to come down out of the swirling clouds of anger and fear that had swept me off my feet for so long. I found my footing, firm upon the ground, a solid place to rest my body and my mind and to put down roots. By tending to the literal roots of plants, I began to experience myself also as a rooted being. Finally, right side up again, my feet planted firmly on the ground. Part 2, Reaching, the garden as community. Those first couple of years in the garden were private, just for me and my tiny family. It was a pathway through the changing world that kept our feet on the ground. My initial experience with the garden changed me in some ways, and in other ways it helped to clarify from that rooted part of myself who I truly am. I learned, for example, as the Iraq War escalated and I continued my anti-war activism, that my true nature does indeed include a desire and a capacity to recognize and challenge oppressive systems. However, the way that I had been ragefully pounding against the doors of those systems in the wake of my post 9/11 radicalization was not true to who I am. Those methods were keeping me fearful, angry, reactionary, and as a result, I was not very effective at them. I wanted the world to be better for my daughter, for my community, and for communities very far from mine. I needed to direct my activist spirit towards something life-giving. It's not surprising then that soon the private activity of growing food for my family began to reach out from this nucleus into our community life. When my daughter started kindergarten 2 years into our gardening endeavor, my husband and I offered to start a school garden. We experienced the ways that garden soothes us and had come to see it as an accessible path to health, to connection to the earth, and to our food systems. Neither my husband or I were raised with gardening, and so we wondered what happens when children are brought up with lived, direct knowledge of what it means to feed ourselves. That tiny raised bed garden in the kindergarten yard became the first of several we helped to establish. Our endeavors soon expanded to include environmental education and solar cooking as a bridge between the garden and renewable energy systems. With the support of local and state grants, we established the Fairmont Green Schools Project, a garden-based environmental education program for elementary-age students in our town. These endeavors became a place to focus my political and activist impulses and education. I gravitated to authors and teachers who presented honest analysis of our broken food systems and the environmental injustice and racism forced on urban and rural communities across our country. Rather than wallow in the problems they reported, these authors focused on the many solutions being enacted by communities and local governments all over the world. Authors and researchers like Barbara Kingsolver, Ron Finley, Michael Pollan, Novella Carpenter, and Diane D. Glave inspired solution-focused hope and innovation within me. This, in turn, soothed the tension and anxiety born in my soul from the feeling of prolonged helplessness and rageful responses. Meanwhile, I was working my way through community college and eventually through a degree at Mills College in art history with an emphasis in community arts. Mills offered many opportunities to focus my activist spirit through the lens of community health and beauty. Upon graduation, I took a position at the college with the Institute for Civic Leadership. For 12 years, I had the honor of supporting students to deepen their social justice capacities and commitments in collaboration with many community organizations, and of course, with the school's community garden. It was through this role that I met Beth Waitkiss, founder of Insight Garden Program at San Quentin State Prison in California. I was deeply moved by her vision to help prisoners to reconnect with their own souls and their communities through gardening. Further, the program was designed to reduce prison recidivism by providing quality hands-on job training in garden design, landscaping, and food cultivation. They also recognized that the key to a former prisoner successfully re-entering society was not only employment, but also the need for repair between the person and the communities within which their crimes were committed. And so the IGP program also built distribution systems between the prison and the communities the participants came from, providing food from the San Quentin Gardens to members of those communities. In the 15 years since I was introduced to Insight Garden Program, the seed planted by that pilot program has grown to serve men, women, and children incarcerated in 15 facilities across California, Indiana, and Ohio. I'm still struck by the holistic design of the Insight Garden Program, as well as the explicit connection to spirituality and to healing. During the times I was able to visit San Quentin Garden with my students, I was deeply moved to hear participants speak of the internal transformations that they experienced as a direct result of creating spaces of life, beauty, and nourishing food inside the prison, which otherwise felt so desolate. Witnessing this extraordinary application of gardening as a method of personal and community healing planted a new seed in my relationship with the garden. Up to that point, the garden had been a place of stability in the midst of chaos, a healthy response to political crisis and social dis-ease, and a method to reach out and serve my community. Insight Garden program revealed the deeper healing qualities and spiritual nature of the garden. I realized then that I still had so much to learn from kneeling in the damp soil of my greatest teacher. Part 3. Connected. The garden as spiritual practice. Even the most dedicated students can sometimes stray from the guiding hands of their teachers. And so it was with me in the garden, as over several years, key aspects of my life slowly built up to crisis points, distracting and distancing me from my garden. This disconnection was exacerbated as my family moved to Davis, California, located in the hot, dry Sacramento Valley, with a very different climate than the cool, foggy Bay Area where I'd lived my whole life and learned to garden. My efforts in our Davis garden frustrated and confounded me, and for the first time, I was experiencing more failure than success. When my husband and I separated after a long and painful time, and I began my journey as a single parent on a long road of reclaiming my life, gardening began to feel like a burden. I could barely keep my little family moving forward, let alone support dozens of plants to thrive in the brutal heat of our summers. So I let the garden go for this season of my life. I came out the other side of my marriage feeling emotionally and spiritually bereft. I needed to learn to care for myself, to focus my full attention on rebuilding my intuition and finding new pathways home to myself. I learned through experience and observation that when we reach a moment like this, bereft, wounded, utterly uncertain of what to do, and yet open and willing to consider things that we've never considered before, we often begin to notice pathways forward. Through coincidences and community connections, I found my way to practices of self-development, emotional resilience, and spiritual deepening. Many teachers came into my life during that fertile time of remembering myself. Some of them were fleeting, offering a piece of the puzzle and then drifting back out of my life. Some of them became deeply embedded, slowly helping me reshape my sense of the world and of myself, generating more and more feelings of spaciousness and possibility. While these practices worked on my mind, heart, and spirit, they also worked on my sense of purpose and vocation. Among the crises of that time, I'd begun to feel a creeping dissatisfaction with my work at Mills College. While I was passionate about supporting my students to develop their social justice leadership capacities, I'd grown dismayed at the overemphasis on the external doing aspects of the program. There was almost no space to support students in their being, to address past traumas, to develop emotional depth and resilience, to understand who they are in relationship to the issues that they care about. As I worked through my own trauma and grief and experienced the profound sense of resilience and calm that resulted, I came to understand leadership as best practiced from the inside out. I knew that I was learning things and building skills to facilitate this kind of inside-out journey for others, and I longed to bring them into my work. Further, I could clearly see how much of those who devote our lives to social justice work need support in our emotional and spiritual being, as much as training in the work itself. Although distant from my garden then, the lessons imparted to me by my greatest teacher continued to work within me, whispering of the wholeness of a rooted, reaching, and connected life. This was where my authentic calling lay, somewhere within the alchemy of all the sweet medicines that continued to lead me back to myself. In 2017, after completing a master's degree in social justice leadership, I left Mills to start my business and my teaching practice, Heartscapes. I built Heartscapes at the intersection of self-reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. All the while, my garden rewilded under a blanket of weeds, many of them edible and delicious, I would learn later. Although distant from it, somewhere inside I knew I'd eventually return with a beginner's mind to learn how to grow a thriving garden in the challenging landscape of my chosen home. But I could never have guessed the circumstances that would eventually replant me back in the garden. In a moment of pure symmetry, the garden again called me in the wake of a large-scale crisis. When the coronavirus pandemic began in March 2020, and the whole world began to shut down amidst fear of wide-scale death, I observed several responses within myself. First, I was fairly unattached to the understandable fear that gripped our communities. Not dissociated from fear, not frozen or unable to make decisions, not reacting with the wild intensity of the Iraq War years. 9 years of dedicated, self-reflective spiritual practice had resulted in a feeling of rooted calm and the ability to reach out from myself to really look at what was going on around us rather than shielding my eyes from fear. It felt like a miracle to feel calm and present in the midst of this global storm. The second thing I observed was a deep impulse towards connection. As we retreated to our homes for quarantine, without even thinking about it or making a conscious decision, I found myself back in the garden. Tenderly clearing out the abandoned beds, retrieving tools untouched for years, and settling in for the first time to truly observe the specific characteristics of the seasons and the climate in this new landscape. Like the world around us, I slowed down, embracing this mandate, and as a result, I realized an uncomfortable truth. My previous failures in this Davis garden were due in large part to my need to be in control rather than in connection with the land. This made sense when I remembered the way that 9/11 shocked me into a paralyzing feeling of the whole world out of control. I realized that I had come to the garden seeking one tiny patch of existence that I could feel in control of, that would move to my needs and my desires. In the mild climate of the Bay Area, the garden served me well in this, and I am grateful. But in those first weeks of quarantine, as I settled in to clear and curious observation of the garden and of myself, I learned the first lesson the garden had for me in this new era. While the garden is in many ways a domesticated space, it will never be fully under our control. The garden is a space of alchemy between our needs and desires and the rhythms and the cycle of the natural world. The garden knows what she needs to grow and is also not afraid of death and of loss. Every failure becomes compost for nourishing the next generation. My losses here were not the failures of the plants, but of my own patience, my own willingness to learn and observe. I tried again. I cultivated curiosity over the drive to produce a specific outcome. That first spring back in the garden, I produced very little food, as my learning curve was still very steep. The difference was that this failure did not frustrate or daunt me. It enlivened my learner's mind and motivated me to try again. I began to take my meditation practice out into the garden, to cultivate the feeling of being rooted in the land where I lived, reaching my awareness out into this place and connecting with it on its own terms. As I leaned in to growing food, our nation began to experience pandemic-related food shortages. The garden whispered of connection, and I reached out into my community, forming networks of collaboration and support among gardeners, cooks, farmers, and herbalists. The fear of food shortages was softened through the experience of interdependence and generosity. The lessons of the garden also made their way into my work, supporting others to root, to reach, and to connect. This connection to the land necessarily expanded into an awareness of my presence as a white woman descended from colonizers living on the unceded land of the indigenous Nisenan and Maidu people of this region, and my presence on the land of the Ohlone and Miwok people of my home in the Bay Area. What does it mean to build a rooted relationship with the land among the complex and painful history of colonization, as a representative and a beneficiary of that history? Once again, I found that my years of spiritual practice had gifted me enough resilience to stay with the pain and discomfort of this inquiry, rather than settle back into comfortable avoidance. It's an inquiry I continue to live into through reflection and action. My own journey into authenticity requires it. Rooted, reaching, connected. These are the lessons of the garden, and I will spend the rest of my life learning them. Friends, thank you for joining me on this story time, on this little journey back through my past. I have to say it was incredibly valuable for me to write this piece and to really go back through those threads, look through the tapestry of my life and finding those moments of meaning within this theme of the garden as rooted, reaching, and connected. And I again offer this reflection to you as a way to follow the own threads of meaning in your life around the things that are the most powerful for you. And again, if you would like me to share a practice that can help you through that reflection process, just let me know. I'd be happy to make that video for you as well. And I'd also love to hear your story of coming to the garden, of coming to spiritual practice, of coming to self-reflective practice, of coming to any practice that helps you to live a life that is rooted, that is spacious, that is connected, that's helping you to remember yourself. Please share those stories down below. Reach out if you've got any questions or reflections for me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, may you be deeply provisioned for the journey through the tapestry of your own life. Until next time, thanks for joining me. I love you. Goodbye.